July is the month most gardens quietly give up. Not from neglect, from kindness. The hard spring work is behind you, the beds are full, and the natural thing, after all that planting and hauling, is to let the garden coast into fall. But here's the quiet truth. The seed catalogs never quite get around to telling you. July isn't the coasting month. It's the deciding month. What you do in these few short weeks separates a bed that finishes September lush and standing tall from one that limps to the finish line, tired and mildewed and flopped over in the mud. And there's one job on this list, with a deadline tied to a single date on the calendar. Miss it, and there's no fixing it until next year. I'll tell you which one, and why the date matters. But stay with me, because it only makes sense once you see the one idea underneath all 12 of these. That idea is this. In July, you're not really tending your plants at all. You're tending the few inches of living soil underneath them. Feed the soil, keep it cool, keep it covered, keep it alive, and the soil will carry your perennials through the hardest stretch of the year. Fight that, and no bag of fertilizer on earth will save you. I've been kneeling in these beds a long time, and I've made every mistake on this list, some of them more than once. So let's walk the garden together, the way two old friends would, and go through the 12 things your perennials genuinely need from you this month. Let's start with the one everything else rests on. Get watering wrong in July, and nothing else on this list can save you. Here's what most of us were quietly taught to do, and it feels responsible. You step out every morning, turn on the hose, and give the whole bed a nice light drink. 15 minutes, maybe 20. You feel like a good gardener, because you're out there every single day. But a light daily sprinkle is one of the hardest things you can do to a perennial in summer heat, and nobody at the garden center ever explained why. When the water only wets the top inch or two of soil, the roots follow it. They crowd up near the surface, right where the July sun bakes them hardest. The plant becomes dependent on you. Skip a day, and it wilts. Hit a stretch of 90-degree afternoons, and it collapses. Deep, slower watering does the opposite. Soak the ground so the moisture sinks down 6 or 8 inches, and the roots chase it into cooler, steadier soil. So here's the rhythm. Most perennials want somewhere around an inch of water a week in mild weather, and more when the heat climbs, but given in 1 or 2 long, slow soakings instead of 7 quick ones. A soaker hose or drip line at the base of the plants is gentlest. Let it run half an hour, then let the surface dry before watering again. And you don't have to guess whether you're deep enough. Push a wooden dowel, an old paint stirrer works fine, into the bed an hour after watering. Damp only in the top couple of inches, and you stop too soon. Moist 6 or 8 inches down, and you've done it right. One last thing, and it matters more than it sounds. Water in the early morning. The soil drinks before the day's heat can steal it, and the leaves dry off long before dark. Foliage left wet through a warm, humid July night is an open door for disease, and we'll come back to that door before we're through. Number 2 goes hand in hand with number 1, and doing the two together cuts your watering chores for the rest of the summer roughly in half. You've heard mulch your beds 1,000 times, but here's what it's really doing down there in July. A layer of shredded bark, straw, or finished compost, 2 to 3 inches deep, is first of all a lid on your soil. Bare ground in full sun loses moisture by the hour. Cover it, and the water you soak down deep stays down where the roots can reach it. Second, and this is the one people underestimate, mulch keeps the ground cool. Unprotected soil on a blazing afternoon can climb well past 100 degrees, and most perennial roots simply shut down in heat like that. A blanket of mulch keeps the root zone noticeably cooler, so your plants keep working instead of stalling. And third, it smothers weed seeds before they sprout. Now here's the part that does real harm when it's done wrong, so let me be plain. Keep the mulch pulled back a good 4 to 6 inches from the crown and stems of every plant. I mean it. When you pile mulch against a stem, folks call it volcano mulching. You trap moisture against living tissue, choke off the air the crown needs, and build the perfect little pocket for rot. Pull it back. Leave a clear breathing ring around every plant. That one habit will save you more perennials than any product on the shelf. And if you laid mulch in spring and it's thinned or matted, now's the time to freshen it with another inch, back up to that cool, protecting depth. If mulch is the blanket you lay over your soil, number 3 is the quiet meal you slip underneath it. It's the job that feeds the idea beneath everything. Feed the soil, not the plant. Skip the bag of quick fertilizer this month. Instead, scatter a thin layer of finished compost over the surface of your beds, 1/2 inch to 1 inch, and let it be. You don't need to dig it in. The rain, the worms, and the whole invisible world of soil life will carry it down for you. Here's why this beats a scoop of fertilizer in July. Compost doesn't jolt the plant with a rush of nitrogen, it can't safely use this late, and more on why that matters at number 7. Instead, it slowly feeds the microbes, the fine fungal threads, the earthworms, the whole living engine that actually makes nutrients available to your plants. You're not feeding the perennial, you're feeding the ground that feeds it. This is old wisdom, not a new trick. Sir Albert Howard, the English agronomist who helped set the modern organic movement in motion nearly 100 years ago, spent his life on one stubborn idea: that healthy soil, rich in decayed organic matter, is the real foundation of a healthy plant. A thin top dressing of compost in July is that idea you can hold in your hand. The only mistake to avoid is impatience. Compost works slowly and steadily, that's the whole point. It won't green things up overnight the way a synthetic feed will, but it builds something that lasts, season after season, and it costs you almost nothing but the making of it. So far we've tended the ground. Now let's steer the plant's energy, and this is where a little work gives you the biggest return of anything you'll do in July. Start with deadheading. To see why it works, look at a flower the way the plant does. To your perennial, a bloom isn't decoration, it's a means to an end, and the end is seed. The moment those petals fade, the plant pours its energy into swelling that seed head, pulling resources away from new growth and more flowers to make the next generation. Deadhead, snip off those spent blooms promptly, and you interrupt the whole plan. The plant reads that missing seed head as unfinished business, and for many perennials, it pushes out a fresh round of flowers to try again. That's a real second flush of bloom in late summer, right when tired gardens start to fade. Tracy DiSabato-Aust, the Ohio horticulturist whose book The Well-Tended Perennial Garden has been the trusted manual on this for decades, so much so that gardeners simply call her the Queen of Deadheading, has shown just how much bloom you can coax from a plant with nothing but timely, patient cutting. The perennials that reward you most in July are coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, the repeat blooming salvias, Shasta daisies, and daylilies. Here's the small technique that makes the difference. Don't just pull the faded petals off the top. Follow the flower stem down to the first set of leaves or a side shoot and cut just above it. That tells the plant to branch, so instead of one bare stalk, you get a bushier plant with more stems, and more stems mean more flowers. One honest exception, because it matters. Some seed heads are worth leaving. Coneflower and black-eyed Susan seed heads feed the goldfinches straight through fall, and they stand up beautifully in the winter garden. So deadhead through July for more bloom, then let that very last flush go to seed as summer winds down. You get both. More color now and a living garden through the cold. Number 5 is the one people are afraid to do, and I want to talk you gently out of that fear. Come July, certain perennials just look defeated. The catmint has split open and flopped in the middle. The hardy geranium has sprawled out flat and smothered its neighbors. The salvia's gone to seed, and the bottom is bare sticks. These plants poured everything into their spring show, and now they're spent. Most of us feel sorry for them and leave them be, afraid that cutting hard will hurt them. So they sit there, ragged, all summer, and give us nothing more. Do the opposite. Get your shears and cut it back hard, a good quarter to half of the plant's height. That catmint flopped over at 18 inches, take it down to 9 or 10. The sprawling geranium? Shear it into a tidy little mound. It'll look bare and a bit pitiful for about a week. And then something wonderful happens. Because you've cut away the exhausted growth, the plant redirects everything it has into fresh leaves and new flower stems. Within a week, you'll see bright green pushing from the base. Within 3 or 4 weeks, you'll often have a plant that looks newly planted, full and compact, and ready to bloom all over again. Much of Tracy DiSabato-Aust's reputation was built on exactly this kind of well-timed cutting back. The perennials that answer this best are the catmints, the hardy geraniums, and Roseanne especially is one of the most forgiving plants you can grow, along with the perennial salvias. and lady's mantle once its leaves start to yellow and tire. The mistake to avoid is cutting and walking away. You're asking the plant to grow a whole new head of foliage, and it needs water to do it. So the day you cut, give it a deep, slow soak, and if you like, lay a little compost around the base. Then step back and trust it. It knows what to do. And now we've reached the one I promised you at the very beginning. The job with the deadline. This is number 6, and it's the reason I asked you to stay. A handful of fall bloomers, garden mums, asters, and the tall sedums like autumn joy, can be transformed by pinching. Through late spring and early summer, you nip off the top inch or two of each growing stem, and the plant answers by branching. Instead of one tall, leggy stalk that flops in the September rain, you get 3 or 4 shorter, sturdier ones, covered in far more flowers, because every stem tip is a place a bloom can form. Here's the catch, and here's the deadline. There comes a point in early summer when these fall bloomers quietly begin setting their flower buds deep inside those stem tips, long before you can see a thing. Pinch after that, and you're no longer encouraging branching. You're cutting off the very buds that were going to become your fall flowers. For much of the country, gardeners mark that cutoff right around the 4th of July. It's an easy date to remember, and a genuinely useful rule of thumb. But let me be honest with you about it, because the truth is a little kinder than a hard wall. The real trigger is the shortening of the days, and it shifts with where you garden. Up north in a shorter season, say zone 4 or 5, make your last pinch by late June or that first week of July. Down south in a long, warm season, you can often keep pinching into the middle of July. So take the 4th as your anchor, and lean earlier the colder your winters run. And if you're watching this, and the 4th has already come and gone, don't touch those stems. You haven't ruined a thing. Just let them grow naturally this year, and mark your calendar to start pinching next spring. There's always another season. That's the good and forgiving thing about a garden. Number 7 is a quiet mistake that doesn't show its face until the first frost, when it's far too late to undo. It finishes the thought we started at number 3. Picture it. You give your perennials a good feed in late July to push them along, and they answer beautifully, throwing out lush, tender new growth. Then the first hard frost of fall arrives, and that soft growth is the very first thing to blacken and die, sometimes taking the crown down with it. You didn't help the plant. You handed it a wound, right as it headed into winter. Here's why. Nitrogen, the part of fertilizer that drives fast, green, leafy growth, is exactly what you want in spring, with a whole long season ahead for that tissue to mature and toughen. But a big shot of it this late leaves no time to harden before the cold. So the rule I follow is simple. No high nitrogen fertilizers after the middle of July. Those are the ones with the big first number on the bag, the quick granular and liquid feeds that shout at the plant to grow right now. Now, this doesn't mean starving your garden. There's a real difference between a jolt of nitrogen and gently feeding the soil. That thin layer of compost from number 3 is perfectly welcome, releasing slowly and building the ground without forcing tender growth. Delphiniums, garden phlox, and the tall ornamental grasses punish you hardest for a late nitrogen push. So those in particular, let them harden off on nature's schedule. You're not trying to make the plant grow faster now. You're helping it get ready for the cold. Those are 2 very different jobs. Before we head into the last stretch, and it's the most important stretch because it's about protecting everything you've just built, let me give you something to carry out to the garden with you. Everything we're covering today, the deep watering rhythm, the pinching dates by zone, the short list of jobs and their timing, I've gathered onto a single printable page. A one sheet you can tape inside the shed door or tuck into your garden journal, so you're not holding all 12 of these in your head at once. Point your phone's camera at the code on the screen, and it's yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Consider it a thank you for gardening the honest, patient way. Then come right back, because the next few jobs stand between a beautiful July garden and a September wreck. And the last one includes 3 popular fixes I need to talk you out of, before you spend a single dollar on them. Number 8 feels optional, right up until the night it isn't. By mid-July, your tallest perennials are near full height, their stems heavy with buds and swelling flower heads. All that weight up top. Then a thunderstorm rolls through at 10 at night, And you come out the next morning to find your delphiniums flat across the path. A stem snapped clean at the base. A bent stem you can rescue. A snapped one is simply gone. So the time to hold them up is now, before the storm, not after. The plants most at risk are the tall ones with heavy heads, delphiniums with their hollow snap-prone stems, the taller rudbeckias, tall garden phlox, the big ornamental grasses, and perennial sunflowers that lean like they're trying to walk clean out of the bed. You can buy metal ring supports, and they work well, set early so the stems grow up through them, held upright and mostly hidden. But let me give you the old free method I love best, the one English gardeners call pea sticking. You save the branchy prunings from your shrubs, anything with lots of little forking twigs, and push them into the soil around and through your perennials while the plants are still short. The plants grow up through that twiggy web and lean on it, and by bloom time, you can't see the support at all. It just looks like your flowers are standing tall all on their own. And there's the economic invisibility of it, if you've ever wondered why nobody sells you this. You cannot bottle a handful of twigs. No product, no patent, no spring reorder. It's just an old skill, passed hand to hand, that costs you nothing but the noticing. The mistake to avoid is waiting until a plant has already fallen. Staking a collapsed stem rarely sets it right, and often does more harm. 20 quiet minutes now, before the weather turns, saves you the heartbreak of a 3-year-old delphinium lying in the mud. Number 9 surprises people every time, so let me just say it plainly. July is the right time, often the very best time, to dig up and divide your bearded iris and your daylilies. The instinct says spring or fall, and for most perennials that's right. But these two are the exception. Both bloom in late spring, then settle into a quiet, restful stretch, still gathering strength but past the hard push of blooming. Divide them now, and they've got months of warm soil ahead to settle new roots, and warm soil roots them in faster than the cold ground of early spring ever could. For bearded iris, aim to divide every 3 or 4 years. An old clump that blooms less each season, with a woody dead center and healthy fans crowding the edges, is a plant asking to be divided. Lift the whole clump, throw out the old woody rhizomes in the middle, and keep the firm, plump ones with healthy leaf fans. Cut them apart so each piece has a fan of leaves and a section of rhizome with white roots. Trim the leaves to a short fan so the wind can't rock them loose. Then replant the rhizome right at the soil surface, barely covered. That last part matters. Bearded iris buried too deep simply will not bloom. Daylilies are even more forgiving. Lift the clump with a garden fork and pull or lever the fans apart by hand. Replant at the depth they were already growing. Water them in well and mulch around them. And here's the part I love most about this job. Every tired old clump you lift becomes many. One big daylily might give you a dozen new plants. Keep what you need, and the rest become gifts. A division passed over the fence to a neighbor. A start for a grandchild's first garden. A swap at the church plant sale. That's how the best gardens have always spread. Not through a store, through hands. The garden pays you back in plants to give away. Number 10 is the disease that shows up right on schedule in July, and the good news is that the best fix for it is free. Powdery mildew is exactly what it sounds like. A white, dusty film creeping across the leaves of your phlox, your bee balm, your asters. July invites it in, with warm days, humid air, and nights that cool down. It rarely kills a plant outright, but it weakens it and leaves it heading into winter rundown. Here's the thing the spray bottle aisle won't tell you. The most powerful control isn't something you buy, it's air. Mildew thrives in the still, stagnant air trapped inside a crowded plant. So go into your most mildew-prone clumps, the phlox and bee balm especially, and thin them out. Take out roughly 1 stem in 3, right at the base, to open up the center. Suddenly air moves through the plant, the leaves dry faster, and the mildew loses the damp, close quarters it needs. Then, 2 habits that cost you nothing. Water at the base of the plant, never over the top of the leaves. And water in the morning, not the evening, so the foliage dries in the sun instead of sitting wet all night. Do just those 2 things, and you'll measurably cut your mildew before it takes hold. Remember that wet leaf door from number 1? This is where it swings shut. For the long run, the real cure is the plant itself. Newer mildew-resistant varieties of garden phlox, David and Robert Poor among them, and the tougher wild-type bee balms, shrug off the mildew that flattens the older kinds. Replace your worst offenders over a season or two, and the problem quietly fades on its own. Now, you've very likely heard that a baking soda spray is the answer here. Hold that thought for just one more minute, because it belongs with number 11, and the 3 fixes that sound good and mostly let you down. Which brings us to number 11, the most important job on the list, and the one where I most need you to trust me, because there's a lot of confident, wrong advice out there that will cost you money and make your problem worse. July is peak season for the Japanese beetle. You know it the moment you see it. A metallic green and copper beetle, feeding in crowds, skeletonizing leaves until only a lacework of veins is left. And the honest truth about beetles is that the most effective thing you can do is also the most humble. Go out early in the morning, while they're still cool and slow, with a bucket of soapy water. Hold it under the feeding beetles and knock them in. The soap breaks the water's surface so they sink instead of climbing back out. A few mornings of that through the peak weeks, and you'll carry a moderate infestation through the season without a drop of chemical. It isn't glamorous. It just works. Now let me talk you out of 3 things. The fixes that sound good and mostly backfire. The first is the yellow beetle trap, the pheromone bag you see hanging in every hardware store. Here's what the research actually shows. Dr. Daniel Potter, an entomologist at the University of Kentucky, who spent much of a long career studying exactly this, found that those traps lure far more beetles onto your property than they ever managed to catch. You're not trapping the neighborhood's beetles. You're inviting them to dinner in your yard. If your neighbor wants to hang one, well, that's a kindness to you and a headache for them. Don't make it yours. The second is milky spore, the powder sold to kill beetle grubs down in your lawn. It sounds perfect. A natural bacterium, one and done. But the University Extension Services have looked hard at it, and the results are deflating. In real yards, it infects only a small fraction of the grubs. The early promising studies were never reliably repeated, and even a grub-free lawn won't spare your flowers, because the adult beetles simply fly in from up to 2 miles away. If you truly want to treat grubs, a newer product based on a bacterium called Bt Gallerii has held up far better in testing. But for most of us, the morning bucket does more than the powder ever will. And the third, the one I asked you to hold on to from number 10, is the baking soda spray for mildew. It's harmless enough, and it can slow the spread a little on leaves that aren't infected yet, but it does not cure mildew, no matter how often it's passed around as a miracle. The airflow and the morning watering we already talked about will do far more. Save your baking soda for the kitchen. I tell you all this not to be a wet blanket, but because it's the whole promise of this channel. I'd rather tell you the honest thing that costs nothing than sell you the exciting thing that doesn't work. And number 12 is the simplest of them all, and quietly the most important. Walk your beds. Every few days. Not to work, just to look. 5 slow minutes with your eyes on the plants tells you everything the other 11 jobs depend on. When the mulch has settled and wants a fresh inch, when a tall stem is leaning and needs a stake before the storm finds it, when the first faint dusting of mildew appears on the lower leaves while it's still small enough to stop. The gardener who notices early spends a fraction of the time and worry of the one who looks once a week and walks out into a crisis. While you're walking, 2 small habits worth keeping. Wipe your shears with a little rubbing alcohol between plants when you're working around disease. 30 seconds that keeps you from carrying mildew from one plant to the next on the blade. And when you cut off a mildewed stem or a beetle-chewed leaf, put it in the trash, not the compost pile. A backyard compost pile often doesn't get hot enough to kill those spores and eggs, and you don't want to hand them a free ride back into the garden come spring. That's it. That's the oldest tool you own. Your own attention. Nobody sells it because nobody can. It was always yours. 12 jobs. It sounds like a lot, written out in a list like that. But walk back through them, and you'll notice they're really all the same job, wearing 12 different hats. Keep the soil cool. Keep it covered. Keep it alive. Steer the plant's energy where it does the most good. And protect what the soil has already built. I learned all of this the slow way, the way most of us do. There were summers I watered every single morning and couldn't understand why my perennials still sulked. Summers I reached for the bright bag of fertilizer in July and paid for it at the first frost. Summers I hung the beetle trap and wondered why the beetles only got worse. Every mistake on this list I've made, some of them more than once. Kneeling in a bed not so different from yours. And what finally turned things around wasn't a product, it was a shift in where I was looking. I stopped trying to feed the plants and started tending the ground underneath them. The few dark inches that a woman named Lady Eve Balfour, back at the very start of the organic movement, called the living soil. Feed that, and the garden mostly takes care of itself. If that's the kind of gardening you come from, the patient, honest, hand-me-down kind, or the kind you'd like to grow into, then you already belong here. Subscribe, and let's keep tending the old, honest way, together. There's a whole season still ahead of us. Now go on out there. Your soil's been waiting for you.